Good evening, everyone. My name is Mariia, and today I want to talk to you about MVVM-based architecture, which we can use in native iOS applications. And this is the architecture that I eventually came up with after some years of development, and that I think this particular setup is very useful for plenty of cases, and it can be very convenient if, for example, you're about to develop your own application. Maybe you are not very familiar with mobile architectures. So let's discuss what is it all about. First of all, I want to tell why don't we use just the default Apple approach. Then what in general is this MVVM setup and why it was chosen as a base architecture for my architecture setup. Then what challenges do we have implementing this architecture in iOS, add-ons that make our life easier, and pros and cons for everything. So let's start from what Apple offers, and this is the general MVC pattern that Apple actually offers to use when we develop native iOS applications. So here we have view model and view controller, and the idea here is to split responsibilities, and it looks quite simple, and most of the time it doesn't work. So why is that? First of all, we have this massive view controller problem when view controller is responsible for too many things. It just does so much that it becomes so difficult to handle. And second is component communication problem, and this is the consequence of the first one, because it's very difficult to communicate between different view controllers if we don't have like some separate classes that are responsible for very restricted amount of things. So this is in general scheme for MVVM, and here it looks very similar, but here what we do is we consider that view and view controller is just UI, and we have a model, and we put view model in between to communicate, to allow these two communicate between themselves. And it's actually very good to adapt while you still, for example, have MVC in one of the projects, because you can just start to implement this right away. You can add view model and start to deload your view controller right away using this pattern. And it deloads view controller from plenty of UI-related and not UI-related stuff very good. First of all, how will we bind this view, like UI classes and view model that we are just added? And second, where to put everything else. This view model just doesn't give us an answers. For example, where to put our connection layer, where to put our database code and stuff like that. So for binding, we have several options. First of them is to use just native solutions like closures, key value observing, and so on. It's not exactly very convenient because different UI elements in iOS, they have different communication models. Some uses target action, some uses delegate pattern. Some of them just not key value, have not key value observable properties. So it makes, all of this makes work with UI a little bit more complicated than it could be. So this is the other solution for binding. And this is very convenient. These libraries, they are not included in iOS, unfortunately, but they are actually very popular to use. And mostly with MVVM, we use something like this. And this is most probably our future of iOS, because this is a combined framework. It was announced by Apple like a few weeks ago, and fortunately we will be able to adapt it in a few years when we will have to support only iOS 13 and iOS 13 and so on. But for now, unfortunately, we can't use it. And these are additions that built up on top of the MVVM base, and that I used to make everything a little bit more structured. So first of all, I came up with making the custom navigation system, because it is very convenient to some services. So idea here is to divide code according to functions to very small pieces, completely like isolated from each other, and reduce the number of dependencies between them. And second is the system of providers that actually provides all of the above, and also controllers and view models. And let's talk a little more about it. And let's start from custom navigation system. And this is the core of the system, these two enumerations. First one describes the screens in application, so it's like really easy to expand and add as many of them as you want. And the second represents the type of transition. So here we see only two default transition types, but again, it can be expanded if needed. So next is the coordinator class itself, and this class is responsible for transitioning to different scenes in our application. So what it does, it uses this transition to scene with transition type method, which we actually can call like from our view models to transition to any other application. So we have really good control over navigation. Also, in this particular case, this has this tab bar controller setup, and this is because as a root controller in my pet project, I have this tab bar controller and 4 tabs, and I decided to move it to the separate method. But for example, if you had as a root controller the navigation controller with some sequence of other controllers, then we could have a little bit different pattern. We could have additional transition type, root transition type, and just present everything with transition to scene and completely exclude additional setups. Next are services, and this is the example of service. It's database service, and well, it's quite stupid, and it knows only about database and nothing else. It can save, update, load, so it has no idea about UI and anything else, so it's quite isolated. And this is how it all actually binds together. This is app delegate, and this happens when the application actually starts to load. And we have these provider setups here, which include one into another. And in the end, this allows us to receive this coordinator and present the scene that we need. In this case, we set up the bar controller, which is root. But, of course, we can have some issues here. First of all, like this setup is not exactly a good solution if you have some really small application, like one screen, or not so much UI. Then MVC will be just enough. You don't maybe need all of this. Second, we have many additional classes, like a lot of them really, because for example, if we need some view controller, then we have to have a view model for it. Okay, let's put table view inside of this view controller, and there will be custom cells. So we need a view model for each of custom cells. Okay, now we need custom header, custom footer, 2 more view models. Now we need some additional custom banner. I don't know, maybe it's some kind of event or something. 1 more view model. So we need plenty of these additional classes, but this is actually not exactly the bad thing, because this code should be like in application anyway. So it's good that it's structured, but it can be a complication. For example, if new people come to project, it will take time to understand where they are and adjust a little bit. And yeah, also at this point, while we still need some binding solution, and most probably it will be third-party library, it's not exactly suitable for all projects. It depends on requirement. Maybe there are requirements that are not allowed to use Eric Swift, for example, or any other libraries. So this also can be a complication, and we still can face issues deciding where to put some specific code. For example, recently I received a really interesting question about voice synthesizer, for example. It's technically it's interface, but it's not exactly UI. So I would prefer to put it to service, but it's like very subtle topic. It's open discussion, actually. And now about benefits of this setup. So no massive view controller. View controller is very light. Even if you decide to write all of your UI code inside view controller, which actually works very good with this setup, it still will be extremely light, like almost nothing except UI is inside. Communication is very good with this view model pattern because everything is going through view model, so you have this point of communication, and it's very good for debugging and even for just for understanding what's going on. And it's very good. It works very good in big projects also. And we have all navigation in one place, which is also a very nice benefit because it's easy to make the transitions almost to any screen from anywhere, which can be a problem in MVC pattern. And also, we have the system of the services, and they are so isolated that they are quite reusable, actually. So, for example, this code, it doesn't depend on anything. You can maybe use it in other project or just adjust somehow if you need to, and most probably you will not have to change anything else except of this. And also services do not depend on UI. So for example, if some huge redesign is waiting for you, it will not be a problem. All you have to do is to just change the UI, and most probably services and everything else just remain untouched because features most probably will stay the same. And yeah, of course, all of this means that it's easier to test because we have the smaller models. And that's all. Thank you.
So you mentioned that Apple recently introduced like the Swift UI and the new ways of doing native iOS development. So how does that compare, or like how does your approach compare to what Apple is like? What as the new way of doing things in iOS?
You mean how is it compared to what we will have on iOS 13?
Yeah, or I guess that's the Swift UI.
Yeah, most probably it will. Yeah, most probably it will be Swift UI and combined somehow. I'm not sure if Swift UI is actually a case here, but I can actually answer that question right away because I usually not explore first 2 or 3 betas because they are, well, can be dangerous for your MacBook. So I can't answer you right now, but when I start to explore this thing, I can actually make one more presentation.
Okay, makes sense. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for this presentation. I know nothing about native development, so it's really fascinating to actually see like some of the concerns there. If I looked really hard, I could see like that this MVVM pattern is a little bit more unidirectional in its data flow. Would that be the sort of thing that you were trying to achieve with moving to that compared to the controllers?
If I understand the question correctly, then you mean that I am like isolating the views from model. Yes, exactly. So I want to isolate view controllers as much as possible because in mobile development and in iOS development in particular, it appears that view controller just like have to do a lot of stuff. It have to do UI from one hand, and from other hand, like almost everything else. So if we just use this MVC without any additions, then most probably we will end up with the classes like maybe 3,000 lines and something like that. That will be not very well structured, and that will contain everything, and it will cause the problems when we go to testing. So it's not exactly the desired approach.
Yeah, thanks. I also know nothing about iOS development, so I find this equally fascinating. So I had 2 questions. First, is Apple somehow officially endorsing RX Swift, or is that something cooked up by the community?
It's community.
Okay, so Apple's new hotness that they're launching now doesn't bundle RX in any way?
No,
okay.
I don't think so. At least I don't find any information that this combine is somehow related to RX Swift.
Okay, then the other question was that you mentioned the testability of services. How do you usually do testing in native projects? Like what types of testing do you, or do we do as a company? Because I've often found it a bit lacking when I've dug into it.
Yeah, actually, most of the time it's unit testing. Sometimes it's also UI testing where we just make snapshots, but it's not exactly connected to services. But for example, for unit testing, the services are quite convenient.
Okay, I can imagine. Thank you.
So I used to work on Windows app for many years, and their MVVM is kind of the de facto architecture, and I kind of ended up in one way of doing MVVM, and then a couple years ago I put up this repository composable app architecture actually in Futurice GitHub. Maybe you want to take a look at that, and if those ideas make any sense to you, because back then when I gave the presentation, I don't think there was probably one other people in Futurice working on MVVM, so it probably didn't really find its audience. So it would be interesting to hear your comments on it, or if it even makes any sense as it's described in the repository. I can show you that later on. But
Okay.
But also one thing that I found kind of an important decision to make when writing MVVM is that do you go like view first or view model first? So in your navigation model. So the later years I worked in MVVM, I always went like view model first, so that I would first initialize or create the view model instances, and then just basically tell my navigation service that navigate to this view model, and then the navigation service actually creates the view in mobile application. Most of the time that would be a page, and then finds the correct page template for that type of view model, and then binds the view model to that page. Or I also used view models for smaller pieces of the UI as well, so you might navigate to a dialog or something like that. But I was just wondering, like, did you do like view first or view model first, and how did you handle navigation from page to page or view model to view model?
Okay, thank you for your question. I actually do exactly the same thing that you just described, but I just achieve it with this providers. So I just hide all of this code, this creation in these providers. I have providers for services, providers for controllers, and providers for view models. So first I create services, I inject them to view model, then view model to controller, to according controller, and then I present everything via my coordinator. So it's basically, I think, the very similar approach to what you described. So I also find the type of view model and view controller that are corresponds to each other, and then merge them, like create them together.
Yeah. Okay. So one other question, if I may. One of the strengths of MVVM is that it would allow like basically writing unit tests to a lot of your UI logic because it exists in the view models basically. Did you do that? Did you actually like write tests for your view models? Because I never did, but it's like one of the kind of strengths of the system. So
I actually didn't know that this is one of the strengths of the systems, but maybe I should explore it a little bit more, this particular part.
okay, yeah, thanks.
Thank you.